Well, as I've said, while the Prime Minister and his entourage head off to Glasgow, it seems that they are completely oblivious to the history behind this climate change cult. I have mentioned before the name Maurice Strong, credited or discredited with forming the United Nations Environment Programme. And he said in 1992, quote, "We may get to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for industrialised civilisation to collapse. Isn't it our responsibility to bring this about?" Unquote. Christina Figueres of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change said in February 2014 in Brussels, and I quote, "This is the first time in the history of mankind that we are setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a defined period of time, changing the economic development model that has been reigning for at least 150 years since the Industrial Revolution," unquote. This is the noose into which we're putting our nation's head, intentionally changing the economic development model, making sure that industrialised civilisation will collapse. So, only 11 years ago, in 2010, Ottmar Edenhofer, I've mentioned this before, was speaking ahead of the Glasgow equivalent then. That summit was held in Cancun in Mexico. Ottmar Edenhofer is a German economist regarded as one of the world's leading experts on climate change policy. He said, quote, "Basically, it's a big mistake to discuss climate policy separate from major themes of globalisation. The climate summit in Cancun at the end of the month is not a climate conference, but one of the largest economic conferences since the Second World War. One has to free oneself," he said, "from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore. This is about wealth transformation," unquote. That's the background. Unfortunately for Mr Morrison, he's not off to a flash start, because economists and business groups are saying that the refusal to release modelling underpinning the plan makes it impossible to judge whether Australians will be better off or not. The ANU Professor Warwick McKibben, regarded as one of the country's leading climate economists, has said it may be possible that Australians would be better off under the government's plan, but a lack of detail makes it impossible to tell. Said Professor McKibben, "There are no new policies in that plan and no way of knowing whether it would succeed." And the claim that no jobs would be lost in the transition, he said, was highly unlikely. And remember, as Václav Smil said, as we now stand, the world gets 83% of its energy from fossil fuels. And then he said, quote, "Now I'm told that in the next 30 years, by 2050, we're going to go from 83% to zero. That strains one's imagination." But the Prime Minister's plan says renewables will have 85% of electricity generation by 2050. According to Václav Smil, we currently get 91% of our energy from fossil fuels. Up in Queensland, the powerful CFMEU mining division has warned of a regional revolt against both major political parties for their, quote, "chest beating over rival net zero emissions targets." Now, the politics of this are critical. There's an election due early next year. I've got people texting me in high dudgeon, obviously Liberal supporters. One said the polls show people are open to nuclear. Well, the Prime Minister was asked about that on the Paul Murray show last night. His answer has further inflamed the Liberal base. Listen to this.
Right now, there's a moratorium on nuclear here in Australia, and the Labor Party are totally opposed to it. And I'm just not going to put Australia through the argument, which doesn't get us anywhere because the moratorium isn't lifted, and for the Labor Party to run around at the next election and get themselves elected on the basis of a scare campaign. I mean, that's just what would happen. Unless there's a bipartisan commitment to this, then it'll be too difficult to proceed with at this point.
I'm sorry, Prime Minister, can I just ask you, is this leadership? I'd be going to an election saying we are in favour of nuclear energy, we want the ban lifted. If you agree, vote for us, not them. But instead of leading, the Prime Minister is following. I'll only go nuclear if they come with me. Well, to bring some perspective to all of this, let's go to Greg Sheridan, the very respected foreign editor of the Australian newspaper, who wrote only recently, quote, "Net zero emissions is essentially a fraudulent concept that can never be realised in the real world." And Greg joins me. Greg, thank you for your time again. It's lovely to talk to you. Look, there's a very disturbing truth about what you say. What are we being sold here?
Well, Alan, I agree with virtually everything you said in your editorial, but oddly enough, I've been very tough on the government lately, but I actually think ScoMo has done about as well as any Australian leader could here. I certainly agree he's squibbing the thing on nuclear, but leaving nuclear aside. So, one of three things is going to happen. Either technology is going to come to our rescue and we get to net zero, or we get to net zero under existing technology, in which case we're all grossly impoverished, or we don't quite make it to net zero. Now, I suspect that we're not going to quite make it to net zero. And I'm kind of reassured that there's nothing specific in this plan. I think Liberal supporters and people on the centre right should recognise that what Morrison has really done here is make the minimum gesture necessary to stop Australia from being beaten up by all these kind of self-righteous Europeans and the Biden administration. But he hasn't really given away anything. He hasn't committed to anything.
I've made that point. I mean, the politics of it I understand, but supposing we get to net zero, you have said, of net zero emissions by 2050, this will result in damaging, potentially catastrophic, short-term economic actions that won't do anything much to help the planet, but will hurt Australia. Now, that's not alarmism, that's fact.
That's right, Alan, but I don't think we're going to get to net zero or anything like it. So this is a little hysterical moment the world is living through right now. I don't contest the basic science about climate change, and I think it's good for us to reduce our emissions and look for cleaner sources of energy. I certainly agree we should, gallop towards nuclear energy because it's net zero emissions and it's reliable and it gives you base load forevermore. But you can't get to net zero. It's a meaningless concept because human civilization requires emissions of greenhouse gases. So if you ever got to net zero, which you never will, what happens the next year? You have 300,000 immigrants. You've got to build homes for them and so forth.
Yes.
And so your net zero is all gone.
Absolutely.
What this strategy, I think, shows is, and the government will hate me saying this, is that they don't take net zero seriously either. And I give them full marks for that. It'd be much better if we could have a completely honest debate. But on the other hand, if you've got to go down this Paris is worth a mass, a certain amount of climate hypocrisy road, for them to do it without legislation. Now, if the technology comes along, if green hydrogen becomes cheap and so on, and you can, massively reduce your emissions, not get to net zero, but massively reduce your emissions at a reasonable cost, we'll be the keenest country in the world to do it.
My concern is in the immediate time. Now, are banks going to be allowed to not lend to people who don't have a net zero climate change policy? This is where we're heading. I mean, how does the farmer get any money if he has to first explain his net zero climate change policy? And all these superannuation funds and banks are going along this road. I mean, how then, in the light of that, do we take advantage between now and whenever of our extraordinary fossil fuel resources if capital goes on strike?
Well, I think Keith Pitt made a very good point, the Minister for Resources, when he said it's not democratic to have banks and trade union-controlled superannuation funds decide which industries can operate in Australia. Now, there's a limit to what a government can do about this, but I think the international circumstances might change. You see, we shouldn't necessarily regard this hysterical moment as permanent. So imagine next November, say next week, the Democrats lose Virginia. Next November, they lose Congress. Biden can't get his climate legislation through even as it is, even with the Democrats controlling the House and the Senate. And say the US goes back to financing fracking and all the rest of it, well, then our banks might take a different view, or there might be alternative methods of finance. I mean, our future developments will have to be environmentally sensitive. I'm not a complete Visigoth about this. I want us to reduce emissions and be sensible and proportionate and so on. But at the same time, if we say that a coal-fired power station, supercritical, high energy, low emissions, would be a good thing to do and the banks won't finance it, you could say because it's a politically induced market failure, the government might lend the company the money. Now, it's hard to imagine a government as timid as this one doing that, but we've had these moments before. Kevin Rudd convinced us that we had to have a carbon tax. The whole world was going to have emissions trading systems and so on. The ETSs all around the world collapsed. They were a joke. They were completely corrupt. They led to nothing.
This is the latest fashion, isn't it? I mean, just on to the politics. If 3 cabinet ministers, Barnaby Joyce, Keith Pitt and Bridget McKenzie, don't agree with this policy, and they don't, and some nationals will go to the election arguing against it, what do you see as the political consequences of all of this?
Well, there's big danger for Morrison that he does bleed votes on the right and the left. He'll be attacked from both right and left here. But Alan, I'm not someone who is scared of criticising the government, and I am ferociously unhappy with the government about nuclear submarines at the moment. But yes. I am inclined, in a rare moment of beatitude, to give Morrison the benefit of the doubt today, because what he's really done is he's made the minimum concessions possible. His critics are all right to say that there's no new policy in this. So he hasn't imposed, at the level of the federal government, a single dollar of extra cost on the economy to go to this, phony net zero commitment. And in fact, he's doing what a lot of other countries have done. Yeah. Canada and New Zealand have much more ambitious short-term targets than we do, but they've reduced their emissions by much less than we have. It was the United States that pulled out of the Paris Agreement, not us.
Yeah, I suppose the point is that people don't like being treated as fools. I mean, the world has only achieved a drop from 87% to 83% fossil fuels, and now we're being told that that's since the whole thing began way back in 1992, and now the next 30 years, by 2050, we're going to go from 83% to zero. I mean, it does, as Vaclav Smil said, strain one's imagination when we're burning more than 10 billion tonnes of fossil fuels and we're dependent on them in every facet of our existence. How can we ignore those views?
Well, Alan, I mean, the left ignores them because they live in a fantasy land.
Yes.
Britain is saying that it's going to cost them £50 billion a year to get to net zero. That's what the British Treasury is saying. And they are an infinitely easier economy to decarbonise than we are, because they're a services economy with no big distances to cover and no resources to export. So if it's going to cost the Brits £50 billion a year, it's going to cost us much, much more. But my guess, Alan, is it won't really happen. And Alan, why don't you and I make a date? Let's meet here on this network in 2050 and see if we've got to net zero. I bet you, I bet you a Chico roll that we haven't made it to net zero.
I agree with you entirely, Greg. Wonderful to talk to you, and the clarity of your thinking. It's fantastic. And by the way, good luck with the book, I have to say. How's all that going?
Oh, it's going great, Alan. It's just about to tick over into the bestseller list. So thank you very much for that.